just wanna talk about some books. Hey, I just wanna talk about some books. Talk about some books. Talk about some books. Hey, I just wanna talk about some books with you.
Hey everybody, I'm Jo,
And I'm JoJo.
and this is Canonical Nonsense.
And we're just 2 cups of Jo reading books.
And today we are 3 cups of Jo because we are going to talk about Tooth and Claw by Jo Walton. So just to start out with the background, Tooth and Claw is a standalone novel that is a Regency-era drama, but where all of the characters are dragons. This book won the World Fantasy Award. Jo Walton, as an author, is a pretty prolific writer and has won multiple awards for her writing. But I personally haven't heard of any of the books when I was looking at the series that she's written. I didn't recognize any of them. I don't know if you did.
I didn't look, so no, I didn't recognize any of the books I didn't look at.
Okay. However, listener, if you really like this author, this is another book that she's written. So
What is Starling, what's the word I'm looking for? Condemnation?
recommendation.
Recommendation, there we go.
So just a little background on why she wrote this book. Apparently, she was reading a book by Anthony Trollope. He was a Regency era writer, and she was really frustrated by the way he treated women. He had some very archaic views that were very harmful about how women should and could act. And he also believed that they could only fall in love once in their life. So she was reading this at the same time that she was reading an Ursula K. Le Guin novel. And when her partner came home from work and asked her how reading was going, she said to him, well, this book really doesn't understand dragons. And her partner thought she was referring to the Anthony Trollope book and was really confused. And that is how this book was born. So she wanted to make this book as a commentary on the way that Trollope and some other Regency era authors thought of women in that era of time, as well as the kind of monstrousness of the Victorian era. Whether or not she was successful in doing this, we will talk about, but that was her intent.
Before we get started, as always, this is a spoiler-filled podcast. We are a pro-spoiler podcast. In fact, we read some of the spoilers in this book at one point because we weren't sure if we wanted to keep reading it. But that being said, if you want to read this book and you don't want it spoiled, then read the book first and then come back to us and you can comment along with us about the book.
So before we do begin talking about this book, I do want to give some trigger warnings because there are some doozies in this book. We have, first of all, cannibalism. The book starts out right away with cannibalism. We do also have cannibalism of children. We have the murder and dismemberment of children that happens on page. Murder is pretty common throughout this book in general. We also have attempted sexual assault. We have depiction of sexual assault through it's in summary, it's not happening on page, but it's describing the past of a character. So her past is described as containing sexual assault and also forced prostitution during this time as well. And then finally, we do have death during childbirth. So we have a few. So if any of those make you feel uncomfortable, if you find any of those to be really a deal breaker for you, or you just need to protect yourself, that's okay. You can meet back up with us in our next book, which hopefully won't have these things in it. We'll see.
It is worth mentioning that this book it's not like, oh, there's a little bit of cannibalism. There's like quite a lot of cannibalism, mostly in the beginning.
Mhm.
So if you're like, wow, this is a lot of cannibalism, can it keep going at this level of cannibalism? Not really, but like a lot of cannibalism.
Goes on longer than I thought it was going to. I thought it was just going to be in that first chapter and then kind of referenced throughout the rest of the book. But I was wrong, and it is in a lot of the book.
We were texting and I was like, there's a lot of cannibalism. And you're like, oh, I think it's going to stop soon. And then you texted me, you're like, no, there's still a lot of cannibalism.
Yeah, I think we actually almost put the book down for different reasons. For me, it was actually because of how much cannibalism, and for you, it was that awful death and childbirth scene. But I was like ready to put it down way before that scene happened. So I do have some themes that we can go over, but I think we should just start on the plot summary, and then we can kind of touch on some of those themes as we go through, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, we think about all this cannibalism. Let's like continue talking about all this cannibalism.
There's so much cannibalism. Oh my God. Okay. So the book begins with the patriarch of the Agornan family, Bon, on his deathbed. His deathbed is a depleted hoard of gold because dragons in this book do sleep on gold if they have gold to sleep on. He is attended by his son, Pen, and Pen is a parson with this dragon church. He asks his son to hear his last confession, which Pen initially refuses because this act of confession is no longer done in the church. It's seen as sacrilege. We do see kind of this odd stand-in for Pen is definitely like a Protestant church official, and then there is a dragon version of Catholicism in this book as well. And there is like some tension between those two religions, which is interesting. However, his father tells him that he really wants to confess anyway, stating that when he was a young dragon, he actually ate his siblings to survive. We learn that in this book, the only real way dragons can grow is by eating other dragons. So there are certain dragons who can't eat any other dragons. The servant class, for example, can't eat other dragons' flesh. So they never grow above 7 feet tall or long. Bon is 70 feet long at the beginning of this book when he is dying. So he's obviously eaten a lot of dragons in his time. And the sacrilege is not because he ate his siblings. The sacrilege is that he killed his siblings and ate them when they were healthy. In general, in this book, you're supposed to just eat the weakling dragons who are dying or dragons who have already died. You're not supposed to kill them for the purpose of consuming them.
It gets a little modest proposal-y in this book,
Yeah.
where it's not just it's mostly like you should eat dragons that are about to die and that are really weak, like young and old, and then also already dead. But there is also a little like, if the family is too big and doesn't have enough money to support all of its baby dragons, like you can take a couple.
Do you want to explain what a modest proposal is to people who
Oh,
maybe haven't read it?
I meant to read it and then I forgot. Shoot, I'm gonna cut that out. A Modest Proposal is just a Jonathan Swift essay that is pretty famous. Jonathan Swift came from was in the 1700s, I believe.
Yeah, he was also an Irish man
An
during,
Irish
like,
man in the 1700s.
which wasn't a great time to be an Irish person.
Yeah, I mean, there's not been a ton of great times to be an Irish person, as someone who has Irish descent. Especially in Ireland, but this was during the height of colonial British rule,
Yeah.
and basically it was responding to the Protestant English who were complaining about the Catholic Irish having too many kids and like not being able to support themselves and also living in squalor, of course, while they're living under colonialism. So of course, like I wonder why things are so dire and they don't have any money.
Yeah.
But he was like, "You know what? If there's too many Irish kids running around, why don't the English just, like, eat a couple of them?" You know? Like
And make fine gloves out of their skin is another thing he said. This was satire. He was satirizing what the British were saying because he was so angry and frustrated with this like really harmful rhetoric that they were saying, well, the Irish just can't take care of themselves. And that's why they're poor when there were obvious structural reasons why the Irish were so poor. And it was because of colonialism. So the like weird divide between like the dragon Protestantism and the dragon Catholicism is also, I think, like the book nodding to a modest proposal as well.
definitely nodding towards it. I don't know,
Yeah.
it as somebody who was thinking about this towards the beginning and now thinking about it after I've read it, it really doesn't stick the landing.
No, it absolutely doesn't. It kind of gave me an icky feeling, if I'm being honest, the way that it kind of talks about the two religions, but
But we'll explain over the course of the book as we talk about it why both it's referencing this work of satire and also how it doesn't really live up to it.
it doesn't live up to a lot of things that it's trying to do.
Well,
Anyway,
yeah, plot summary.
anyway. So he states that for this reason, he wants his body divided up in the same way as his gold, which he asked in his will. He says to Penn that Penn and his sister Berend, who are his older children who are more established, they can only take one piece of his gold as a symbolic inheritance, and to give the rest of his gold to be divided equally among the younger three siblings, whose names are Hainer, Avon, and Selendra. And he wants his body to be divided the same way, where Penn, because he's a parson, there's a rule where he only is allowed to eat the eyes of the dragons that he like attends their deathbeds, but Baron is only supposed to eat one bite from his flesh, and the same with Baron's husband and children. And then the rest of his body is to go to the younger three siblings. So he explains this to Penn, and then he dies. And then Penn eats his eyes. And we're like, oh, okay, right away with cannibalism. The next chapter starts with the other siblings just waiting for him to die. Berend is waiting in, I think, like a parlor kind of area. They live in caves, but their houses are described similarly to kind of like large mansions that would have existed in England at the time. So Berend's sitting in this waiting area with her husband, who is named Davarak, and he is a very wealthy landed dragon. They also have 3 children, one of which is green. We learn here that usually green children are called because they're seen as weak. Whether they actually are weak or just seen as weak is never really explained or described, but they haven't killed or eaten him yet. Also in this room is a dragon named Frelt, who is another parson. He is the parson of the estate that they are on, and he's extremely petty. He wanted to marry Berend when she was younger, but Bon didn't allow this to happen. And he is like kind of looking at the 3 children thinking that, oh, that green dragon should have been culled by now. They should not have let him live. They also kind of have this conversation about how Berend is very good to be having as many children as she is having, because many of the poorer farming families are not having enough children. They should be having more. And Davarak then kind of comes into the conversation and mentions that one of his farmers just had children and that he was planning to eat their weaklings and then feed the liver to his green child to make his child stronger. But then he hasn't had the chance because he was called to Bond's deathbed. So very modest proposal in that sense.
Yeah, it's pretty horrifying. I mean, everyone in there is a monster. Frelt is like, well, I guess I didn't get Baron, but like at least I have good taste because she married well. So like me not getting this girl reflects well on me while being really sexist and gross. And they're like
Yeah,
talking about how they have to call their farmers because they can't afford it. But then also they're like, why aren't they having more babies? You're just like, what?
when Frelt kind of introduces, because he's thinking about these 3 baby dragons and looking at the green one, and he's kind of reflecting on the fact that in his clutch there was a green dragon that was culled. And at first you kind of think he's thinking like, well, it was unfair that my sibling was culled when this child is able to live just because of his station. And then you realize he's thinking the kind of opposite, where he's like, oh, there's no reason why this other child should exist ever, because he's green and green is a weak dragon color, and that means he should be called. It's kind of like you feel gross in the pit of your stomach reading about these horrible people. And this is really the first step into this really amazingly unsubtle book, where the book is just like hitting you over the head with these ideas of class, these ideas of soon to be ideas of gender, in a way that you're like, yeah, I get it. I get it. So while they are talking about that, the 3 younger siblings, Selendra, Hainer, and Avon, are in the dining room and they're talking. And they talk about their arrangements after Bond's death. Hainer is to go with Berend and live with her and Davarak until she is wed. And Selendra is to go with Penn and live with him until she is wed. The 2 sisters are very worried and distressed about being separated at this time because they are very close. They're clutch mates. So they're kind of just talking about that. They're then called down to eat the corpse, and Davarak is able to enter Bond's room first. He starts eating him immediately. He like rips a leg off of Bond. It's like really gross. And Penn's like, hey, like you can't do this. This was Bond's will, but he doesn't listen.
It's just worth talking specifically about the structure of the scene because it's argued about the entire book. And it's like sort of important to the end, but we'll get to that. Basically, Daverack walks in, rips off a leg, starts going to town, and then Penn is furious and was like, "No, my dad said you each get one bite and then the rest has to go to the people who are poorer." And Daverack's like, "No, he meant that about the money. Obviously, I get to eat as much as I want because I am rich and important." And Penn is like, "No, that's not what he said. Frelt, back me up." And Frelt is an absolute jerk. And he is thinking only about who he wants to get over in any situation. And right now he's still pissed at Bond about the whole thing. So he's like, "Nah, I think Daverack's right." And then Penn's like, "No, he's not." And then Fret's like, "Prove it." Not actually like that. It's much more like hoity toity. But Penn can't do that because he can't 100% word for word say what was said on the deathbed because of the sacrilege of the confession that happens. So Fret rules against Penn, mostly because he hates Bond and lets Daverack eat a large portion of Bond's body.
Yeah.
And this is important because after that, they call in the children and they are so distraught about basically finding.
Well, he doesn't only just eat it. He calls in his Davarack calls in his children and rips open Bond and is like, "Eat," and then they eat like all of his organs. The children of Davarack do. Um,
So the green dragon does get its liver.
yeah, and Baron comes in and she takes one bite, but it's a very large bite. And Penn notices this, how like kind of diplomatic she is, where she's satisfying both Bond's wishes, but also Davarack's wishes by eating a very large bite, but it's still one bite. And then she takes the cup and leaves. But by the time the other three siblings are able to get into the room, less than half of the corpse is left.
So Avon is so mad about this because he kind of needs it to get bigger because he needs to he Dragon Society is both like very structured and has like laws and rules and stuff, but then also you kind of need to be able to punch people sometimes or claw people sometimes. So him not being able to get bigger because of his dad's body is like detrimental to his career.
I think your social status is really defined by how big you are because it shows how many other dragons you were able to eat. Like it shows on your person. Like there's no way that you can hide your wealth because it's the size that you have been able to achieve. So it's really important that he can show that he has grown when he goes back to be able to advance because this was really his one sure chance of getting dragon flesh to eat because he doesn't have any other relations that he reliably can consume. So I think it's kind of showing that like the death of your parent, unless you are the person in charge of the land, like Daverack is in charge of his land, so he's the one that can eat all of his servants and his servants' children and all the weaklings. But Amer is not, so he can't. Aven is not. Yeah, there are a lot of. There's so many names in this book that are so similar to other names. So frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's like really pissed.
I mean, also, like, Avon talks about how he can't take over his father's land. They have to give it to Daverack, who will, like, appoint a ward, and then eventually him and Baron's kids will eventually inherit their father's name, not Avon,
Yeah,
because he's not
yeah,
big enough to fight off other dragons for it. So it, like,
yeah,
really screws him over. And the reason I wanted to, like, do the whole play-by-play of this is that Avon then decides to sue Daverack as part of this slight of eating his dad's body. Oh, sounds so weird saying out loud. Uh, he sues because he's mad that Daverack basically ate half of his dad's body when he should have eaten most of his dad's body.
yeah. So that's the end of that scene. The next day, the head servant, her name is Amer. So we have Avan and Amer. We have Hainer and Hathor. We have Cher, Selendra, and Sebeth. It's just like too many names that sound like other names in this book.
This is a
Like,
book
too much.
designed to trip up podcasters that are not good at fantasy names, which is us.
Too many names that are similar. Like give them like a name that starts with a J, like us.
Yeah, good J name.
Anyway, the next day, Amer, she's their head servant, and she's been in the family for a really long time. So dragons can live, it seems like up to 500 years, perhaps even longer. And she has been in their family for quite some time. I think at least 300 years, maybe.
She was like their mom's wet nurse or something.
Yeah, she was the wet nurse of the children, but for their mother too.
They don't have wet nurses because they're reptiles, but
The equivalent of.
yeah,
So just a little like world building around the servants and the parsons. So they have their wings bound. The parsons have their wings symbolically bound. So it's a loose cord that's wrapped around their wings and they don't fly. But the servants their wings are bound by their masters basically, and they are not allowed to fly. It's kind of stated that at the Agornan estate, the wings of the servant are never bound tightly. And with Amer, it is her wings are bound as loosely as a parson, and they do just let her fly as she needs to because she was actually like collecting herbs to make medicine for Bon, and they really treat her as kind of as a family member in many ways. They really respect her and they respect her advice, they respect her opinion. So she's an interesting character. I wish that like well, she's still like a paper cut out of a character, I guess. But anyway, the next day she asks Selendra if Selendra can take her with her to Pen's estate or the estate that Pen is living on, because she has heard that Davarak eats his older servants who are still healthy. Selendra kind of considers this, but as she's considering this, Frelt arrives again at their house. Has convinced himself that he wants to marry Selendra, and Selendra is the one who comes down to greet him and let him in because they are, kind of required to give hospitality to their parson when they arrive. He proposes to her. She refuses. He tries to persuade her. She refuses again. He leans on her in the process and is like kind of starting to get physical with her. And she is able to flee. So she flees from him and enters into the dining room where her other siblings are still assembled.
pretty clear what he's trying to do. He literally thinks about literally like picking her up and taking her away to
Yeah.
like, you know, we don't want to say it, but like it's like, okay, he wants to ruin her so he can have her.
Yeah, there's no subtlety in this book. He is trying to compromise her basically, or get, and even if that weren't the case, like it kind of seems like he's trying to make others think that he was able to put her into a compromising position, which is like a theme in Regency era novels. But she enters the dining room and her siblings say to her like, "Oh, Selendra, you're turning pink." And we learn that a female dragon flushes pink. So female dragons seem like they're all born gold. And then when they kind of have when they it kind of seems like if they are touched by a male dragon that they aren't related to, they flush pink.
It's pretty unclear what does it in the book. It's like sometimes it's just the words will make them flush
Yeah.
pink, and then sometimes it's physical contact. It's like it's a weird biological essentialism of like a fake
Yeah.
concept. It's
I guess you could call it sexual dimorphism, but it's fucked because they turn pink and they stay pink forever. It's not like they're just like blushing. They are changing color forever, so it's showing on their skin that a male dragon has either proposed to them and they've accepted it, which seems like that's what sometimes happens. So that's what happens with Pen and Pen's wife. He proposes to her and she flushes pink. But it also seems like if they are just touched by a male dragon, they can turn pink, which is what happens to Slendra. She turns pink. Her brothers immediately start trying to think of ways to marry her off because she's obviously been ruined. And she and Hainer go to talk to Amer, who then is like, "Oh, well, we can fix this." And she brews her a potion that turns her back to gold. But when she gives Selendra the potion, she warns her that there is a possibility that, number one, it won't work and she'll continue to be pink. But the other possibility is that she will never be able to blush again. She'll always remain gold, even when she wants to blush. And she also says, like, "Oh, the more you take the potion, the more likely it is that you're never gonna blush," which I don't know if you want to like talk about this.
like a really unsubtle, like, abortion metaphor. Women in the back room are brewing some herbs as the men outside are literally talking about selling her off either to the person who just tried to assault her
Yeah.
or to, like, some rich guy who's already got a wife who would, like,
Wants a consort.
assault her but take care of her. Like,
Well,
it's
maybe not assault her, but, like, kind of assault her because it wouldn't be her choice to enter into that situation.
yeah, but basically keep her as the mistress.
As a mistress, yeah, and it's also harmful in some other ways because, like, it's obviously supposed to be a, like, way of talking about abortion, but there is a harmful myth that the more abortions you get, the less fertile you become, which is not true. It's just not true. If you were getting, like, proper, like, medical abortions, it doesn't make you less fertile, but it is a myth that is perpetuated often. So it's kind of frustrating that it's here in this book.
You had to see a weird myth about abortion show up in your dragon book and being like, "No, abortions are safe. I don't know why fake dragon abortions aren't, but
Yeah,
whatever."
we have magic in this book where you grow and you eat another dragon, but abortion isn't safe. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, especially on top of biological essentialism, where if a guy is untowards to you briefly, it might ruin your entire life. It's like, what a terrible system.
Yeah, and all he actually does is lean on her. Like, he doesn't touch her like, I mean, he's touching her, so he's touching her inappropriately, but he's not, like, fondling her. Like, he leans his neck, I think, on her neck, and it causes her to blush. So it's like that little amount of contact can make you blush if you're a female dragon. It's just, like, horrifying. Like, this changes this so much into the realm of this horror story when it's absolutely not trying to be a horror story. I know that there's cannibalism in this book, but it's still trying not to be a horror story. And yet, like, this is so much more horrific than the cannibalism in some ways. But anyway, while she's drinking this tea, the two sisters make a vow because they only received 8,000 crowns as their dowry, which is a very small amount. So they make a vow that they're going to tell people that their dowry is the sum of both of their shares, so 16,000, and that whomever marries first will invite the other to go and live with them so that they can always be together. They also say, like, oh well, we have to both approve of the match, so you can't just marry someone that the other one doesn't know. And then Selendra goes to bed. She goes and rests. She does turn back to gold, and the dragons go their separate ways. So dragons do have a train system. Dragons don't like the gentry doesn't like, they think it's kind of a low calling. They think the highest calling is farming and cultivating farming on your lands, but Bond did invest in trade and then established a good railroad to carry goods into the city. This is how the servants and parsons who are not allowed to fly travel, and this is also how children travel. So when dragon babies are born, they don't have wings. They develop their wings later in life. So Painter and Avon discuss the lawsuit. She tells Avon that she will not be safe at Davarek's estate if she is part of it while living with him. And she tells him, like, do not put me, I'm not going to be part of this lawsuit, basically, because it's not safe. Davarek then comes and gets her. We learn that Barrand is pregnant again, so she didn't fly with Davarek. You wrote a note here. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah. So Deborah comes and Bernard is pregnant again, and they're like, "Wow, so soon? That's dangerous." And I'm just like, they're gonna kill her in pregnancy because of course they am, because that's a dumb trope, which doesn't even make any sense because they're an egg-laying species. Like, their
Yeah,
childbirth is just not as dangerous as ours. So I was like, how are they gonna make her die in childbirth? I was like,
well, just
oh,
wait.
just wait.
Well, I kind of was, like, hoping that that would be subverted. So we do have a conversation earlier when Hainer, Selendra, and Amer are all in the kitchen, and she's drinking that drug, where Amer is talking to them because their mother died in egg birth. And this is, like, apparently ultra common. There's only one older female dragon in this whole book because, there's this myth that all women before modern medicine died in childbirth, which is not true. Again, we have this other harmful myth about female anatomy and, like, women giving birth at this time. If all women died giving birth, we would have no people. Like,
Yeah. It's just curious. Part of the reason we chose this book after reading Temeraire is or His Majesty's Dragon is that we were really interested in we wanted to see another book that took two canons, the like fantasy canon, in this case the Regency canon, and smushed them together. And in His Majesty's Dragon, they do like a really good job of like taking elements from both, but like incorporating them in interesting ways, in ways that
Mhm.
make sense with both of them.
Yeah, and subverting ideas and concepts and themes from
Mhm.
both of these genres. And this book seems to think that it's doing enough just by putting them into the book and not having a conversation about them.
Yeah, to the point where some of it didn't make like the cannibalism stuff maybe makes sense, but a lot of the stuff about like women is like confusing. Like just confusing biologically.
Yeah, it makes sense for dragons to, and I think maybe the commentary she was trying to say is like, "Look how ridiculous this is when we put it in the context of dragons." She has to take one more step. If she had taken one more step forward, I think I would have been like, "Okay, yeah." But she doesn't. She kind of just puts it in there and expects us, the reader, to do all the legwork. But because she just sets it in there, it does feel like she's just falling into the same cliches that these books have that she dislikes. So anyway, in the conversation that happened earlier with the three female dragons, the servant is talking about how like the amount of clutches you have is kind of hereditary. So because their mother died after in her third clutch, that the that Hayner and Solyndra should be fine as long as they stop at two, and as long as those two clutches aren't too close to each other. So we already kind of get this information about how like if your mother died giving birth to her third clutch, then you're probably going to die giving birth to your third clutch because all of these female dragons die giving birth to eggs. It seems like it's inevitable for these female dragons. It's very rare that they're going to live a full long life. And it's really sad.
Yeah, so we get a heavy dose of foreshadowing and then the everybody splits off.
We cut to Avon, who arrives at his house in the city. He whistles as he enters to alert his clerk, who is also his live-in girlfriend, basically, and her name is Seabeth. And we learn her whole backstory in a matter of 2 paragraphs. She is the disgraced daughter of a nobleman, and she was forced to turn pink and is unwed. So she is a character we learn through this kind of summary of who she is, that she was kidnapped as a child and ransomed to her father. We don't know who her father is until the end of the book, though it's easy to guess if you read the book. And he refused to pay the ransom because he said, "Well, I have other children." So the people who are holding her ransom says that they forced themselves on her, made her blush pink, they assaulted her multiple times, and then they forced her into prostitution to pay off the ransom, which she did. Like, she paid off the entire ransom. And then after she paid off her ransom, she killed the person who was keeping her, which makes no sense.
I don't mind having like sexual assault survivors in stories,
No, I think that's important to have.
but just the way they talk about it is so weird. Like she's
No.
like, she put up with it and then she didn't after she'd paid off her ransom like a good girl. And you're like, what the fuck?
Yeah, she was a victim in the right way. She wasn't a victim in the wrong way because this
Oy.
book obviously sees or thinks that there is a right way and a wrong way to be a victim, which there is not a wrong way to be a victim.
I don't know if it sees that, but it doesn't draw that line. So you can read either way.
Yeah, okay, maybe it doesn't say it directly, but I think like the way that it brings up these other themes of femininity and issues with gender, again, it's falling into this cliche of like, oh, well, she was a victim in the correct way. Look how good she is. She paid off her ransom before she killed him because we need to see her as this tragic figure. And ugh, ugh.
If we wanted to be incredibly generous, we could say that this information is given us from Avon's perspective. So, and as we've seen with other perspectives in this book, it's probably pretty biased, but they never correct the record.
Also, don't need this information at all. We could just have Avon saying she was forced to flush pink. She, and then just said like probably was assaulted and is a ruined woman because she's now pink and unwed. I think there's something frustrating about this idea that she could like, if she had just been assaulted once, that wouldn't have been enough to make her character, like, tragic
Mm.
enough in the eyes of the author and the eyes of the reader. And it's just frustrating because it's like, it should not be like, this isn't the Olympics. Like, we aren't like, we don't have to be competitive with the trauma that we receive. Receiving trauma is receiving trauma, and it doesn't need to be worse or better than someone else's trauma to be valid. You know what I'm saying?
I do understand. I think I agree with you completely. And I just, the one more note before we move on is that I think it's important that she's a nobleman's daughter because
Mhm.
if she was just a regular person, well, then, well, oops, sorry. Like, it's tragic because it happened to someone rich.
Yeah, and like Avon wouldn't have cared if she was just like a working class, I guess is what it
Yeah.
would be. Yeah, he wouldn't have given a shit. He sees her as tragic because she was the daughter of a nobleman and she had prospects.
Anyway,
Painter arrives at Davarak's home and she finds out that they have eaten that green baby dragon because Baron laid one egg and she was really hungry. So then they just killed their child and ate him.
I I don't maybe I'm misremembering it. I don't know if it was specifically because she was hungry. She has been eating more dragons because, like, to protect herself from the clutch.
I think it's implied, it's not explicitly stated.
They also say that they basically killed her because they have more spares now. They're like, when it was just the 3 of them, they needed all of them, but now that there's gonna be more, they can, like, toss over the weaklings.
Yeah, it's fucked.
Yeah, this book, it's fucked.
The next day, the 3 of them fly to see the farmers, so they kind of invite Hayner in this way that's like, "Oh, would you like to come see the estate?" And Hayner's like, "Oh, sure, I would." And when they arrive, Davarak immediately is like, "Where are your newborn dragons?" And they find that they were hiding 2 of them because they were green, and they didn't want Davarak to find them because they knew he would kill them. So Davarak kind of ritually kills them and dismembers them. He gives 2 legs to the family. So he lays down 2 legs, one from each dragon, to the family. And he gives 1 leg to Hayner, and then he divides the rest between him and Baron. He does give Baron like the majority of the body, but it's this obvious show of like this inequity that even though these dragons didn't want their children to die, even though they are the offspring of these dragons, they still they don't have a right to the bodies. The bodies go to the people who own the land. And it's really disgusting. Like this was when I was like, I don't know if I could read any more of this book if this is going to continue going on because I don't know, there's just the like death of these children was just so disturbing to me in a way that I wasn't expecting. I really wasn't expecting that I would be affected in the way that I was affected by how disturbing it was to experience the death of these 2 children while their parents like cried and begged Deverak to stop harming them.
Yeah, this is sort of also Hannah's real awakening. It's
Mhm.
her "Are we the baddies" situation where she's like,
Yeah.
maybe it's not okay that we have the power to murder and eat the people beneath us.
But then she still eats the leg.
Yep.
She does still eat it, which is kind of her, like, what she does throughout the book, but we'll get into that as we continue. So we cut to Phelan, who is Penn's wife. She is introduced as she is flying up to the Benandi house to ask the Exalt, who is the dowager of the Benandi estate, to hire a carriage for Penn because he can't fly up to his house. And the Exalt is the only mother who is alive in this book of an adult dragon. The rest are dead. So Phelan is a mother of children. Barrand is currently alive and is the mother of children. And then we have Amir, who is an older dragon, but she never had children. The Exalt is a bright red dragon, and she's quite large. I don't think it ever said, does it say how large she is? I don't remember.
Her son is 60 feet,
Yeah.
and I think she's close to that.
Okay.
So, like, size is, like, such a big thing, and they talk about it a lot. They'll be like 20 feet, 40 feet, 60
Yeah.
feet. But a lot of times you don't get a sense in a scene of the different scales. Like, you often
Yeah.
will have people or dragons, not people, dragons interacting with other dragons that are literally 10 times their size. And because there's not a lot of descriptions of things in a scene, it's just a lot of talking, you never really get a strong sense of like how people match up to each other unless they literally
Yeah.
are like, this person is 60 feet, this person is 20 feet. Those are two different sizes.
Yeah, it is kind of odd. Like when Hayner is interacting with Davarak and he's like threatened because he threatens her at certain points in the novel, we never get this feeling that she's like, he's so much bigger than I am. And it's scary how much space in a room he can take up. And when we're going to be introduced to Cher in a moment, when he is interacting with Selendra, the only time we ever get Selendra kind of thinking about how big he is when he is playing with the dragon children, but not when he's interacting with her. And she's only like 20 feet long. So he's 60 feet long. He's 3 times as large as she is. She should be thinking about how tall he is.
I'm an average sized girl. I've been on dates with men who are 6'4", and let me tell you, I'm just talking to their belly button the whole time, and that's all I'm thinking about. So
I'm a lot taller than you. And even if I'm standing next to someone who's 6'4", I'm like, oh, you're a big person. You're tall. And if I'm standing next to a short person who's like 5'0", I'm like, oh, you are very little. Like that's just a few inches. So it doesn't
yeah,
really make sense that they never even think about that size difference, just like as a way of kind of considering the other dragons that they're interacting with.
yeah, every time me and you
Yeah.
talk about how small I am, you
You
know?
are very small. You're
So
little.
I I'm an average sized woman. But anyway,
I'm taller than average, so
yeah, it's weird that they'll be like, "Anyway, they were this tall," and then it never comes up in a
yeah.
scene.
It's weird. I think that this book is kind of the prose in this book and the way that it describes the environments are written in a way that you kind of don't notice them. Like I couldn't really tell you, I could not describe most of the settings that they're in to you. They're so it's just like a sketch of a space that then they're inside of and talking in. And I think that was intentional by the author. I don't think that she wanted the scenes to really take the forefront, but it would have been nice to have a little bit more about the characters and what they were looking like because we get these like long descriptions of their hats that they're wearing, but we don't get this description of like how big they are in comparison to each other.
Yeah, at one point, I tried to focus on the prose in this book because I really felt like I had read so much of it and hadn't noticed it, and then I was
Mhm.
like, "Oh, that's intentional." There's, like, nothing, you just slide right off of it.
Which is fine. Like that's a choice that the author made, and I think that's fine. Yeah, I agree with you though that I wish that the dragons had a little bit more information about their scale to each other. But just to give you a little bit of a description on the Exalt, she is a bright red dragon. So after the female dragons blush pink, they slowly start to turn red throughout their life. If they never blush pink, they turn gray. And this gray color is described as ugly. They also are described as toughening under the chin. And I don't think that it's described that the red dragons toughen under the chin. I don't exactly know what that means. I assume it's like kind of like this analogy that means like they get a little chin hair, as women do when we get older. But I'm not sure. But the Exalt's a huge dragon. She's bright red. We also meet Cher, who's a bronze dragon, and he is the Exalt's son. As JoJo said, he is 60 feet long. And we learned that she, Phelan, and Cher have been friends since childhood. When she talks to the Exalt, she is worried about Cher's marriage prospects and resolves to help him find a wife. So Phelan and Cher meet Selendra and Penn at the train station. Cher invites Selendra to hunt with him, which Solendra's interested in, but Penn's like, oh, if women were meant to hunt, they would have been given claws. Because the female dragons also don't have claws like the male dragons. And this does allow the female dragons to use tools. So female dragons can write. They can use pen more easily than male dragons. They use rifles. They hunt with spears and rifles, which is really interesting, but we don't really get into that a lot. Pen can write because he's a parson. All dragons, it seems like, can read, or like the gentry can read, but not all male dragons can write. But Pen can write, but he does remark about when he does write, he does remark on how difficult it is for him to hold a pen in his claws.
Note on this is
Yeah.
that this is when we're first introduced to Cher, and we kind of get the feeling that Cher is one of the good ones because
Mhm.
not only does he invite the women out to like hunt, when Penn's like, I don't know if ladies hunt. He's like, actually, women are like great hunters because they can use spears and rifles. So actually, I'm a feminist.
Yeah, Cher, feminist icon right here.
Such the lowest bar that he's the most feminist person in this book.
He can walk over it easily because he's so big, you know? He's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
he's also the biggest guy, which is like another trope in like modern romance, which is kind of funny.
He's so rich,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
also he, like, did play around and hang out in the city, and, like, now he's, like, thinking about settling down, like, he's had his
Yeah.
fun, but it would just be, like, kinda nice to live a quiet life in the countryside. It's just like, ugh, sorry, it's just, every trope.
He's such a cliche character.
That's why he's so big, he's full of tropes.
Oh, yeah, maybe. Anyway, so we cut back to Avon, who wakes up next to Seabeth, and she tells him that he needs to wear a hat in the city because respectable dragons wear hats. And they have this fucking long conversation about hats and like the kind of hat that Avon has to wear because he's technically in mourning, but he doesn't want to make himself look weak. And it has to be a hat that he can easily fly with because hats fall off really easily when you fly. And they only wear hats, they don't wear any other clothes. And it's just like the book pointing really hard at I mean, like, look how silly this Regency bullshit is. And it's like, we get it. We get it. And it was so annoying to me, the reader. Avon meets with his lawyer, whose name is Hathor, not Haynor, but Hathor, about the lawsuit. And then he goes to work where a dragon named Kest is harassing Seabeth. And it's like kind of leaning on her and like trying to touch her. And it's just like another villain. He attacks Kest and tells him that he can't do that again and basically threatens to kill him. We kind of get a little bit in his brain of like he kind of wants Kest to continue to be a dick because then he could kill him and eat him. But Kest does relent, so he lets him go. Learlin, who is Avon's boss, then gives him a case to work on, which has to do with beautifying and restructuring a poor district in the city called the Scamble. Then we cut to Seabeth, who's going to an old church in the Scamble. And this religion was illegal for a while, but is now just frowned upon kind of recently. I think they say 30 years, which in dragon years is like nothing. And it's obviously very coded as the Catholic Church. And this church is it's full of very poor people who are really described as like these like the noble poor kind of is how they're described. Like, you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, they're like, "Oh, these are poor people, but they're, like, still good people," and, like, there's no subtlety in this book. So, like, whatever you're thinking about when you hear the word noble poor, that's it, but dragons.
Yeah, it's like how there's a right way to be a sexual assault victim, there's a right way to be a poor person, which is like, oh my God, please stop acting like there's a right way to be poor and that there's a right way to be like these people who are. It just sucks. There's no like kind of further investigation within this book beyond that which already exists in actual Regency novels. And that's very frustrating because this book was written in 2003. Anyway, she confesses to the priest and tells him about the fact that Avon is now in charge of the fate of the Scamble. The priest is like, "Oh, thank you for telling me this." And he kind of gives her some advice on like how to influence him so that he doesn't destroy the church itself. And that's the end of that scene. We then cut to Solyndra, and she's really enjoying herself. She and Cher flirt a little. He takes her flying and thinks about how she might be a good match. Solyndra thinks about how nice it is to fly. You wrote a funny note here.
At this point, Solyndra thinks it's nice to fly, and Cher is like, "You know what? I think I wanna settle down. She's pretty." Basically me looking at Girls on Hinge, just being like, "You know what? Maybe this one will work," which was very funny, and then Solyndra, because she's a good romantic heroine, is oblivious. She's just like, "Isn't it nice to be out with my friend?"
And he's like a brother to Penn and to Phelan, so he's safe for me to be around, and I won't be disgraced by being alone with him, kind of thing.
Yeah, she's like, "He's great, and I'm an oblivious romantic heroine."
They then go to dinner at the Benandi house that the Exalt is throwing. The Exalt wants Cher to hit it off with this woman named Galiner, who is a really high-born woman. She's an eminence. So there are like the respectables and I don't remember all the terms, but the eminence is the highest. The Exalt, I think, is right below eminence, if I'm remembering correctly.
There's a bunch of made up fantasy terms about class.
Yeah, but she really wants Cher to hit it off with Galiner because she's so high class and she's like the most eligible in the marriage market currently. And Solyndra also meets Gleaner, and she's like, "Oh, my father was a worker on your family's estate when he was a young dragon." Because her father is technically, he's new money, he's not old money. So he worked his way up from being a farmhand to being a noble landed gentry. And she just mentions that to him, and Gleaner's like, "Oh, interesting." And kind of is talking to her about it. But then the Exalt is like, "Solyndra, you shouldn't talk about your family's poor beginnings. It's unbecoming. You should talk about your mother's side because your mother's side has a much richer heritage." And Solendra's like, "But I don't know the people on my mother's side." And the Exalt's like, "It doesn't matter. You don't want to bring up your father. He's poor." And she gets really upset because she's like, "I'm not embarrassed of my father's beginnings."
He died a week ago, and they were literally like, "Maybe Slyndra shouldn't come because she still seems really sad," as she's, like, kind of, like, sobbing out a window, and they're like, "Nah, she should come to the party."
She's fine. A party will cheer her up.
Yeah, and then they insult her dad immediately.
Yeah, and so Solyndra gets really upset and shares like, "Mother, you shouldn't talk like that," and like kind of comes to her aid because he's the good guy. And now Solyndra and the Exalt are at odds with each other because we have to have a bitter, bitter old woman. We can't have a mother who cares about her son's happiness, who's actually worried about his happiness and not just his connections.
We need someone who represents shitty aristocracy so we can have good aristocracy.
Yeah. The next chapter is focused on Hainer. She notices that her lady's maid has a sore on her back where her wings are bound and asks to help. The servant then kind of confirms Amer's suspicions. She says that if she shows weakness, Davarak and Baron will eat her. She also tells her that he eats healthy babies of farmers and the old servants who are still helpful or healthy. And this is not technically allowed, but it's not like a law that's enforced against. And this really disturbs Hainer.
So Davarak's not supposed to eat people unless a parson is involved, but we've already seen with Frelt that, like, the church sucks.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and then we see that he's willing to eat those babies when the parson isn't there.
Yeah, so it's like the church is supposed to stop the aristocracy from just running rampant, but they're both corrupt, so wah, wah.
And Davarak is 50 feet long, just so you're aware. This does really disturb Hainer because she's like, "Well, we never treated the servants like that on our land." And she never really thought about the way that servants were treated on other estates. So she decides to write Solyndra about it. Then the writ that Avon filed against Davarak arrives, and he's like absolutely incensed. He snaps his jaws at Hainer's throat, and Hainer really thinks for a second, like, "Oh, he's gonna eat me." And then he says that he'll countersue Avon for all that he's worth, and Solyndra, because Solyndra is also on the writ. And then they'll use what they take from them to dower Hainer, because Hainer's kind of dealing with this difficulty because even with the 16,000 crowns, she doesn't have enough to be really enticing to the other to the other landed gentry. And she does have a man who she's kind of talking to, but he's not rich enough to be able to take her dowry. Davarak then breathes fire for the first time, and it really frightens them. The children, who are already frightened because they think they're going to get eaten because their brother was eaten, huddle against Hainer. They then eat dinner, and Davarak leaves to practice breathing fire. Baron warns Hainer not to interfere with Davarak, to just let Baron handle it for Hainer's safety. And she says, like, he's not going to kill you because he does like you, but don't interfere because, like, that could change. Hainer then writes to Solyndra to ask if servitude is morally defensible. And she kind of tells her what's going on with the estate. She is afraid. And then she like walks her mail down to where the servants take the mail and lays it there. And then she's like, "Oh, well, but Davarak might read my mail." So she then decides to take it to the post herself. Not because she's like, "Oh, well, maybe we shouldn't depend on servants for everything." She does it because she's afraid that Davarak will read her mail, which shows kind of her selfishness, even as she's like trying to have this enlightened idea of class, which in some ways I thought that the book was like trying to be self-aware and to show her hypocrisy, but it never really lands.
No, it's real one step forward, two steps. Well, one step forward, one step back. She's like, "Ha, I guess maybe slavery is bad, but like we did slavery so good. Who can tell?"
We all have people in our lives who like they consider themselves feminist, or they consider themselves like, "Oh, friend of the poor, or friend of a group of people," and then they still have like pretty extensive blind spots when it comes to that. And you're like, "Eh." There's still a lot of problematic things happening here in this person's idea of how they see themselves. It seems like the book is kind of acknowledging that she is that kind of person, but still is not able to really do anything with it. After that scene, we cut back to the Exalt. She talks to Cher about Solyndra. He admits that he does have feelings for her, but the Exalt doesn't believe that she is a good choice. So she requests that he takes his time and he agrees. But he says, "Oh, well, we should all go on a picnic up near this waterfall. And we should take the dragonettes with us," which are the baby dragons, which are Phelan's two baby dragons. And they do take them up in a basket because they can't fly. We have a lot of nameless, faceless maiden dragons that the Exalt has invited to try to entice Cher. Galena is also there. He calls her an icicle because she's not emotional and she keeps closing herself off to him more and more because she's trying, like, the book is like, look how much of a bitch this woman is because she doesn't like Cher and she's not open and warm. And it's just like, oh my God, like, come on. People cannot click and not be evil. While they're eating, one of the dragonettes does disappear. Solyndra, by this point, when they realize that the baby dragon is gone, most of the dragons have already departed. So it's just Galena, Cher, Solyndra, and Phelan. They realize that the dragon must have gone into this nearby cave and they start looking, but Galena's like, "It's cold. I want to go home. You have to take me home right now, Cher. We need to stop looking for this dragon. It's probably dead anyway." And Phelan is like having an emotional breakdown because she thinks her baby's going to die. So Solendra's like, "Look, Phelan, why don't you take Galena home and I'll continue looking with Cher." So the two of them go together to look for this baby dragon. They find him hanging from a ledge inside of a pit, but Cher is too big to go into the pit, so Solyndra has to be the one to go down and get him. Once she does get him, they do have to descend further because she just can't take off from, like, in the space of the pit. And then they land on a giant pile of ancient treasure. Cher is able to get down to them, and he tells them each to take one piece and that they'll get the rest later. But he's like, "We're rich. All of this gold. Wow, there's so much of it." It's like thousands and thousands and thousands of crowns of gold. He then gives Solyndra a jeweled chain and flirts with her. He's like, "Oh, a pretty chain for a pretty girl." And she's just like, "What's happening right now?"
Yeah, she's like, this Galena person and Cher seem to not be hitting it off, and he's giving me this chain and telling me I'm beautiful. What could this possibly mean?"
Yeah, she's not like, "Oh, he's flirting with me."
Yeah, we're gonna do a little something weird in here, which is we're gonna take a break from this scene because it takes a break in the book.
It's so weird.
So they're flirting and they're walking out of the cave, and then they're like, and we'll find out later, and they cut to back to Davorak, who's meeting with his attorneys, and
In
then,
the
like,
city.
yeah, in the city, and he's just, like, really grumpy about it, and his wife's at home pregnant, and it's just a scene of him being annoying and shitty and, like, spending too much money on his case and, like, not sure if he'll win it or not. Yeah, so they're, like, in the cave, trapped in the cave, and then they're just like, "Anyway, so Davorak's doing this. This guy you kind of remember is, like, proposing to Hayner, and she's upset because he hasn't talked to her in a while, and she thought he liked her, but it turns out he's not talking to her because he's part of the aristocracy, but he's poor, so he can't marry her because she doesn't have any money, even though they kind of like each other. So he's like, "I don't know, if you get rich, call me." And then she's like, "I don't think."
So talks about trying to find his fortune, but then she's
Yeah.
like, "Well, how do you treat your servants?" And he's like, "I don't know, we treat them fine." And he kind of tells her that he treats his servants in a way that she thinks is similar to the way that the Agornan estate treated their servants. So she's like, "Oh, well, that's how we treated our servants."
Anyway, I just like, "I think servitude's bad." And he's like, "Oh, you're a rascal. Anyway, if you get rich, we should marry."
He calls her, he's like, "Are you a radical?" And she's like, "Maybe." And he's like, "Keep that to yourself, but that's fine." And, like, he's, like, chill about it, and she's like, "Oh, maybe I do love him."
Yeah, and then there's this what I think is the most interesting scene in the book, which is Baron and Hayner. So at some point you were like, how is, like, all of the other Agornan siblings are just, like, appalled by the way Davorak is, like, maintaining himself and, like, maintaining his estate and all of the, child murdering he's doing.
Mhm.
So we get to look at like Baron's mind, where
Mhm.
she's just like, well, I got pregnant so soon because I wanted to manipulate him. And I think if I like make him happy, I can like get all of these things from him. And I have him wrapped around my finger. And even though we're doing stuff that we don't approve of, but I think I can steer him in the right way. And then also, I think I can get you some more money for your dowry. So you can marry that guy that you seem to like for no reason. That's me editorializing. But we kind of get that Baron is on the family side, but she's like putting up with Davorak and controlling him, and that actually,
And she's picking her battles. Like, she's like, "Well, this isn't really worth." She's surviving in this house and thriving in this house at the
Mhm.
expense of certain other dragons, but she is able to control Davorak in a lot of ways. She's probably the most interesting character in the book.
Which is why she dies immediately after the scene.
Yeah, so she then starts laying another egg and it breaks inside of her. And it's just a kind of a long scene where she's like dragging herself around the house.
Bleeding from orifices.
She like asks Hayner to like, well, she's like, oh, maybe you can just pull it out. And Hayner like lifts her tail and it's she's like the way she
Ugh.
describes it is kind of like she's really disgusted by what she's seen. And then like another dragon was sent because there was another noble dragon was sent to get the surgeon, but they can't send any servants to get the parson because none of their servants are allowed to fly. So Hayner is the only one left in the house who can fly. So she has to fly down to get the parson, and the parson does fly up with her. He's like, it's an emergency, I'm gonna fly. But by the time they get back to her, she's dead.
Yeah, it's horrible, and also, like, the problem is the egg breaks inside of her, which is, like, not once again, not how reptiles work, you know? Do you wanna
Yeah.
do you wanna talk about this?
Well, I did look it up. So apparently, like, well, reptile eggs are soft shelled, which, like, these are dragons. Obviously, their eggs are not exactly the same. It seems like they have hard shelled eggs. But, like, chicken eggs develop in, like, the shell develops in, like, the last 24 hours of them laying. So it's as it's kind of leaving them is when the shell is developing. But chickens, and I'm only speaking from a perspective of chickens, so and I'm not like a chicken farmer, so maybe this is like something that can happen to birds often. I'm sure it happens sometimes where a bird like lays an egg wrong or something and then it dies, but like it's egg laying is supposed to be like an easier childbirth process. Like basically every other animal on this planet is better at giving birth than humans. And it's because we have thin hips because we developed bipedal locomotion, I guess. And we sacrificed wide hips for that. And really only humans have trouble giving birth for this reason and this reason alone. No other animal has the same amount of trouble giving birth as humans do. And for them to say like an egg laying animal has like even a similar state of
Especially an animal that's quadrupedal.
yeah, they're and, like, they say that the females stand up on their hind legs, but they still can walk on all fours. Like, they're supposed to walk on all fours, they just choose to because it's, like, cultural, and they don't wanna get callous hair for, like, palms. But especially, like, an egg laying like, the point of laying eggs is that you can get the baby out of you earlier, like, the fetus out of you earlier, so that you aren't forced to spend all this energy and time developing it inside of you. It gets it out of you and then it develops independently of you, which inherently would be a safer form of birth for the mother because you're pushing it out of you when it's smaller and less developed. There's just no reason why so many dragons die while laying eggs, other than the fact that this author wanted to put this trope in this book.
Baron dies, like, pretty bloodily and horribly in childbirth in Haner's bed, and then we're back on the farm, baby! What's going on with Cylindra? What's going on with Cher? Are they gonna kiss? We don't know.
I don't even know if dragons kiss, but yeah.
It's so
But it goes it's like, "Let's go back 2 weeks in time," is literally what it says. And it's like, "What?
it's so jolly too.
We went 2 weeks with this narrative? Why didn't you just finish off this narrative with, Sharon Salendra first, and then go into this horrifying scene of childbirth? What was the point of that?"
It's It's honestly the most deranged paragraph break or, like, chapter break I've ever experienced.
It was, like, kind of disgusting to me. I was like, "Oh, this is evil to do." Also, when we cut away from Hayner, she's crying. She's not crying because she lost her sister. She's crying because she is afraid of what Davorak will do when he comes home, and she's afraid for herself because she's extremely selfish. I think I can understand, like, yeah, she could be both things. Like, she could be really sad that her sister died, but also really scared about what her future means. And those two things can happen. But it says like, oh, the parson thought she was crying because of her sister, but she had never been very close with her sister. She was just crying because she was worried about herself. We're supposed to commiserate with this character, but at every turn, she kind of does this, makes these selfish decisions, and I cannot tell if it's intentional or not.
Part of it is that we're not supposed to feel bad when bad people die, and therein, by turning a blind eye on Davorak's excesses, kind of sealed her fate.
Yeah.
It's pretty gross.
Yeah. So we cut back to Cher and Solyndra, and they're out of the cave, and Cher proposes, but Solyndra rejects him and it's really just because, like, her heart starts pounding, and she's like having this like romantic response and like emotional response to him proposing, but she's like, I'm not going to be able to turn pink, so I should reject him. So she rejects him.
So the class of it all, she's like, "Oh, your mother would never approve," and blah
Yeah.
blah blah blah
Yeah, she
blah.
tries to blame it on his mother, even though it's really because she it doesn't think she can turn pink anymore. The Exalt then meets with Phelan and tells her that Cher and Solyndra must not be allowed to spend time together because Cher is really upset that Solyndra rejected him and he's really sad. Phelan does disagree, and it's not because she sides with Solyndra, it's because she sides with Cher. And she meets with Cher then, and she's like, "Oh, well, just give it time. I'll try to get Solyndra to come around to you."
No one humors the exile. It's actually kind of funny because she's like supposed to represent proper society, and it's just her being like, "Phelan, she's not good enough for my son. She's not rich enough." And she's like, "You're rich enough. She's a nice lady. She's my sister-in-law. Like, what's wrong with her?" It's kind of funny.
It also shows, like, the impotence of, even though she's technically the most powerful person in the room, because she's a woman, no one listens to her.
Yeah, shares the true heir, so like whatever he wants goes, which is like, right. It's just very frustrating that like
It's this novel that's supposed to be a commentary on these issues, but is just falling into these same issues without actually doing anything interesting with them.
yeah. Yes, it's right that they should marry even like despite their differences in class, but also there's not a lot of differences in class, you know?
No, they don't have a huge difference in class, and we don't even get the sense that they really like, there's not enough time spent with the two of them that we see where we're like, "Oh, they're in love." It just seems like they're like, "Oh, I like that. Ooh, oh, wow, wow, that guy's like, ooh, he's big. He's
Yeah.
very long, 60 feet. He's
Well,
good with children. He, like, plays with the children."
yeah, for Cher, it's like, wow, he's a feminist and he doesn't hate children and he doesn't murder and kill the help without any warning.
We don't know that. That's never addressed, how the servants are cared for at the Benandi estate. We don't actually know.
Yeah, we don't see him murder and kill the help.
There's never a conversation about it, though. And the way that the Exalt kind of talks about Aimer, because she doesn't like that Aimer's there. She's like, "Oh, well, Solyndra just wants a lady's maid, and she brought Aimer to be her lady's maid." And Phelan's like, "Actually, no, she's been extremely helpful with the children, like, and she's been really helpful in the kitchen making all these preserves and things because they make berry preserves." And the Exalt's like, "Well, keep an eye on her. I'm sure she'll slip up at some point, and you'll be able to see that she's actually there for Solyndra." And it's like, "Girl, why are you so, like, fixated on this?"
Yeah. So Cher is a feminist and doesn't hate children and doesn't on screen eat the help. And Solyndra is like nice and helpful. Cher kind of falls in love with her while they're rescuing the kids. So like she
Yeah.
also doesn't hate children and is like a chill hang.
Because Galena is like, "I'm ready to let these children die because I'm uncomfortable and cold." And Solendra's like, "I'm willing to be uncomfortable and cold for the sake of these children." So, obviously, it's a love connection because
Love
she's not
connection.
willing to allow children to die in a cave.
Yeah, I mean, she's genuinely like
A nice person, I guess.
Bare minimum nice, you know?
I mean, wrong or selfish about her character in the way that, like, Hayner is is very selfish in a way that the book seems to be trying to address, but then doesn't really. And there's nothing, like, morally gray about her character and the way that Barrand is morally gray in a really interesting way. But the book shows her to be, you know, irredeemable.
Yeah, the problem with Salendra is that she had an abortion. That's the only thing.
Yeah, and she is afraid that she'll never be able to flush Pink. Penn and Solendra are both called to witness in the city. And Penn is really distressed by this because he's like, I'm going to have to tell everybody that I allowed Bond to give his final confession and I'm going to be removed, kicked out of the church. And so he's terrified. Solendra is extremely excited because she's never been to the city, though she is really distressed because she didn't turn pink and she was like, well, I should have turned pink if I still could have. And she talks to Amer about it and Amer's like, well, just like have him get closer to you next time and maybe you'll turn pink, like don't freak out. And she doesn't like really listen to Amer, but she's really excited to go to the city. So Phelan then tells Solendra that she should at least try to love Cher. Geez, you're stringing him along like this by existing, which is like ugh. And then she takes her to buy a hat. And then she kind of arranges for the two of them to go flying on Deep Winter Morning, which is a holiday, it seems.
Yeah, there's like a bunch of fantasy terms for seasons that
Yeah.
they're just there to be like, and now it's cold, and now it's not cold. You know, it's not very useful. It's just like, oh,
Yeah.
there's a fantasy calendar because they're dragons, not people.
Yeah, which is nice. Like the week has 5 days. Seabeth goes to see her priest again. He tells her that her father has been looking for her because he's dying and he's trying to make amends to everyone he has wronged in his life. She also tells him that Avon has decided not to change the street that the church is on and that she was able to convince him to do a lot of different things within the scamble that will actually help the people of the scamble as well as like enrich Avon and not just like because at first Avon was like, I'm gonna bulldoze the whole thing. And she was able to kind of convince him not to do that.
Yeah, there's a whole weird subplot with Avon who's like kind of not in, like his lawsuit is like a huge driving force of the whole story, but he's like barely a part of the family story. It's very funny.
There's this whole subplot that I haven't even gotten into with Avon and like someone tries to bribe him and he's like, I'm rejecting the bribe.
Yeah, basically Avon's gonna like plow down the whole slums and then he gets invited to go to hang out with some rich people while they're in a bath together. The rich people are like, "Hey, we'll like get you some land and a rich bride if you bulldoze the slums for us." And then he's like, "Huh. Well, actually, I really like Seabeth. So, and I wouldn't give her up for just some random rich girl if I don't have to. And also, maybe we shouldn't bulldoze the slums." And then that's the whole scene. It's so weird and
He
random.
thinks like a lot about like how well once you accept a bribe that hangs over for you forever and he like realizes that that's what this is. Yeah.
It's so random and weird, and it just exists to be like, actually, these people are the good kind of rich people, not the bad kind of rich people. And
Yeah.
actually, Avon is going to use his good rich people powers to save the slums and this church and make sure that the poor people of the city live better. And basically, that's all communicated in like 3 sentences when Seabeth is talking to this priest. And it's like not important to the story.
No, it's not. We never even think about the scandal again after
Yeah.
this, really.
Just another feather in his rich person hat.
Yeah. We cut back to Hayner. Londover, who's the guy that she wants to marry, comes and to visit and gives her a book about servants and like servitude and kind of, rights for servants. He then says that Dabrak, now that Barrand is dead, is not willing to supplement her dowry. So they decide to wait. He's like, oh, well, maybe I'll seek my fortune in the city. And Hayner's really upset by this. So she goes to bed and has her servant burnish her scales until they shine, which again is another example of how she is interested in servants' rights, but is still like completely unwilling to change anything about her day to day to make the servants' lives easier. The first trial date arrives and they call the case to order. And I said that they called the witnesses already, but this is what they call the witnesses. anyway, Phelan and Selendra fly to see the Exalt, and she says that they can stay at the Benandi house as long as Selendra swears off Cher and that she seeks a season in the city. And this enrages Selendra. And Selendra hatches a plan to get back at her. So she goes flying with Cher, and she accepts his proposal on 2 conditions. 1, that Hayner approves of him when he meets her once they're all in the city. And 2, that the Exalt approves of her, which she thinks is never going to happen. And she also kind of has this plan that she'll just tell Hayner not to approve. And because she really believes that she can't flush Pink. So she's like, well, I'm going to get back at his mom by breaking Cher's heart, which is really weird.
She doesn't want to break Cher's heart. She just wants to get back at the
Yeah.
mom. And she's like, well, I can't flush Pink anyway. So
Well, I'll do it by breaking Cher's heart.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's not a well thought out plan.
It's not, yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Penn does admit what he did to Cher. So he's like, hey, I allowed this man to take confession. And they decide to go see Davorak before the trial to try to convince him not to put Penn on the stand because Davorak's lawyers were the ones who called Penn to the stand.
They're also like, by the way, Penn and Cher are like old school friends, and this is the only scene you're going to see them be friendly in that sort of way. It was literally that's what the narrator is saying.
Yeah, inserts that right there, and it's very odd that this late in the book we're getting that information. So they're all in the city now, and while in the city, Hayner meets with the priest, Sebeth's priest, because he's the one who wrote that book that Laundiver gave her. And again, there's this like kind of odd rhetoric that seems to say that Catholics are just better and kinder to poor people than Protestants. It's so heavy-handed. Which again, I think is her kind of making the statement surrounding kind of the themes of Amata's proposal and like kind of the events that were happening at that time between the Catholics and the Protestants. But it just still feels a little weird. Like it's very unnuanced the way that it's brought in.
I think she's saying like Catholics are good and Protestants are bad. It's just sort of like a
Yeah.
church that believes in kindness instead of as like a rubber stamp for the aristocracy to uphold, class. One that's based around forgiveness instead of one that's based around order is better.
Yeah. But it's just so like
Heavy-handed.
yeah, she's just like, let me put this other theme in here. And it's like, we didn't actually like even need this other theme because there's so much happening otherwise that you really aren't handling well. So putting this other heavy-handed theme in here is not, the house of cards is tumbling because of the weight of all this. But when Hayner returns to the house, Davorak thinks that she actually was meeting with Avon. He doesn't believe her, so he locks her in her room and barricades it with a bunch of stones. And she also finds out that he ate her servant because he thinks that her servant lied to her. And again, she cries while she's in the room. She's like, oh, what's going to become of me? And really doesn't even spare another thought for the fact that her servant was just eaten by Davorak until the very end of the novel, where she's like, oh, it's too bad that she was eaten.
To be fair, she just got bricked into a room,
Yeah,
like
but like the way I know, but like it's just another example of like literally your servant died to protect you, and
yeah, there are multiple times where poor people are murdered on screen, and the injustice of that is not felt in any way, shape, or form by any of the characters or by the narrative.
yeah, it just like is kind of thrown in there. Like, reader, you can fill in the blanks. It cuts to Selendra and the Exalt, and they are trading insults with each other. Selendra leaves, and then Cher threatens to eat his mother. He's like, we'll eat you at our wedding feast if you don't like her, if you don't relent. And then he leaves and she cries. The Exalt then holds an engagement ball for Selendra and Cher. Threlt is there with Davorak because he was also called as a witness, and he meets Galiner, who hit it off because they're both bad people. So of course they would hit it off with each other.
They don't actually hit it off though. Like she's just like, I have to get married because that's the society we live in, and he's like, oh, another woman. I feel bad for Glenier, who's like a shitty
True.
person, but
Yeah.
like does not deserve Frelt.
Is she shitty though, or is she just like kind of done with this? Because it kind of feels like in that last paragraph that she's just like, I've been on the market for 3 years and no one has bitten, and I just want to get this over with because this is, you know, it just, yeah, I feel bad
It
for her
doesn't seem
too.
like she has a choice in it. It's not like she's
No.
like, It doesn't even
He
seem like that. It's like there are men that are about to sell her.
I don't know. It's just like a tragic figure in this book who isn't portrayed as a tragic figure because she is supposed to be portrayed as a foil for Cylindra. And it just, again, completely unsubtle book. Deverick tells Cylindra and Cher that Hayner is sick and that she wasn't able to come. The next day, Sebeth goes to visit her father, who we find is the eminent Telsty, who is, again, the eminence is like the highest rank of noble that there is. There's no one above him. He basically is like, I brought you here so that you could forgive me. That's like the first thing he says to her. And he's like, I want to make you my heir, but first you have to forgive me. Let me tell you what actually happened that day. So he tells her that, like, when she was ransomed and he was like, oh, well, I already have enough heirs. He was trying to fake them out because he wanted to hunt them down and get her back himself, but he was too late and they disappeared and he wasn't able to contact them again. But that he had actually been trying to get her back, but then he just kind of stopped for after that, it seems, and just stopped trying for the rest of his life until he was ready to die.
Yeah, she's like, is he just saying that? The narrative itself is like, I don't
Yeah,
know if
she's not sure
he
if she can trust him.
yeah, she's like, I don't know if he said that because, like, also he hasn't tried to contact me until now or look for me
Yeah.
until now. She finds out during this that she had 5 other siblings and they all died.
Well, one joined the church, but yeah.
Okay, so most of her siblings are dead and then one's a parson. And she's just like, "Oh, he waited until all of his
Mhm.
heirs died, and also the makeup heir he had, which is her nephew, got in a big fight with him and now they're not on friendly terms, so he can't inherit anymore. And then also he's like literally about to die. And that's when he wanted to talk to me. But he is really sorry.
And he kind of has these conditions. He's like, if you forgive me, I will make you my heir, but you also have to marry. And she's like, oh, I forgive you. And
Part of it is I do think he's like, you can't be the one to inherit this land because it's all about the land, and we've said multiple times in this book that you maybe need to fight to protect your land, so she will not be strong enough with her dainty little fingers, not
Mhm.
claws, to keep it, so she needs to marry so he could protect it. It's like not clear.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just following the regency rules of women can't inherit land. It has to go to a male relative, or if a woman marries, it goes to the man that she marries, right?
But it's her name, like, she's gonna get her name back, and then the dude has to take the name, unless it's her cousin. So, he's like, "Also, maybe marry that nephew that sucks," and she's like, I don't think
Yeah,
so."
he's like, "You must marry and you must marry your nephew that sucks." And she's just like, "Well, I have a live-in boyfriend." And he's like, "Oh, okay. As long as he takes the Telsty name, then you can have everything." Which I guess means that the person he would then become the heir, right? Avon would
Mhm.
become the heir because he's a man.
It seems like she inherits. It's like
Yeah, they
it's
both kind of inherit. It's, like, contingent on the fact that she yeah,
Mary.
he does kind of say that it's to protect her because she would never be able to keep the land, but it's following the regency rules of women not being able to inherit is, like, what it's actually following.
Yeah. So it's definitely perpetuating the trope of that women cannot inherit, which I guess is less of a trope and more of a historical fact.
It's just a historical thing, yeah.
But, like, they're dragons, so it's it's a little muddled here because it does seem that, like, because the Exalt owns land or, like, runs the thing and
She's
has
the
the title.
dowager,
Ah,
while Cher is kind of gallivanting around, but Cher is the heir, and he can take it at any time. Yeah. I think I find this scene very problematic. Number 1, because he's like, "You must marry," after she, like we know that she experienced all this sexual trauma, and we know that he kind of knows some of it because he's like, "I see that your wings have been bound and that you're pink." So he knows that there's something that happened to her, and he's still like, "You must marry," and she's like, "Ah, fine, I'll marry." But then she is able to marry Avon. The other reason that this scene is problematic is it falls into this trope, and I think you disagree with me a little bit on this, but this is a trope that I think is really harmful. And this is something like if you haven't noticed this yet, you're gonna notice it absolutely everywhere happening like from now on, where a woman who has trauma, often it's sexual trauma, it sometimes is like the trauma of losing a child, like her child is killed, not just like losing a child in childbirth, but it's always a female character or for the most part, a female character. In order for her in the book, narratively, to move past her trauma, she has to forgive, and narratively, she does forgive her point of trauma. And for Seabeth, her point of trauma is the fact that her father said when she was being ransomed that he had enough heirs, because she repeats it multiple times in the book, like, how my stupid father said that he had enough heirs. Like, so he is the person who is the villain in her narrative, right? Because she already got revenge on the other guys because she killed them, right? Like, narratively, the woman is forced to forgive the person who caused this trauma, usually is a man, in order to be able to move past it, which is incredibly harmful, in my opinion. I think it's perfectly fine if you are someone who experienced trauma and you personally want to give that forgiveness, but this trope is harmful because it acts as if the only way forward is through forgiving your point of trauma, which is absolutely not the case. You never have to forgive your point of trauma if that is not something that you feel like you can do or you feel is necessary. But narratively, this is a trope that exists. And this is shown here. It's just another one of these harmful tropes surrounding like how women should act without building upon it or subverting it at all.
And I disagree. Very radical, very religious form of like forgiveness. It doesn't have to be religious, but I think it's often tied to religion where you are forgiving the other person, but like not both for yourself and for the other person. A super valid way of healing is forgiving someone else for wrong done against you. So you are allowing yourself to like not hold on to that incident anymore and heal. And like you can see that in religion as like a way of like moving on from trauma and stuff. I mean, I like to try to practice this sort of like radical forgiveness within myself and other things that have happened. And I mean, I
Think that there's a difference between acceptance and forgiveness, and you can accept that something happened to you and that this other person was the perpetrator of that without forgiving them.
this is like a deeply philosophical conversation that has nothing to do with this book, but like I think you can do either or.
I think the choice in reality is the person who experienced that trauma, and that's up to that person.
Which is sort of what the book is. Seabeth chooses for herself as part of her religious practice. And like this scene is a lot of her and her father talking about their shared religion. She found the old religion on herself, even though they, as a family, practice the old religion, though like very quietly
Mhm.
because like it was bad. Part of the reason she goes there is to talk to him about the old religion, and she goes to him based on the guidance of her priest. And in enacting this like radical forgiveness that she was taught from the religion that she chose for herself after experiencing this trauma, she is able to like move on, and both her and her father are able to like reconcile before the end of it. So this didn't bother me as much because I kind of like this depiction of it.
I don't think it's the worst depiction of this that I've ever seen. I do think that this can be done well.
Mm.
I think that if she had entered the scene and her father's first words to her weren't, "I brought you here so you could forgive me," maybe I would have felt differently about the scene. Maybe if he had started with saying, like, "Look, I know I did the wrong thing. Let me tell you what happened. And I would, I want you to be able to forgive me. And I know that I'm the villain in your story," basically. Like, not obviously saying that, but like if he had kind of approached it in a different way, not "I brought you here so you could forgive me," is so fucking frustrating for him to immediately be like, "The onus is on you," even though I know I'm the one who did the wrong thing.
He
Um,
acknowledges though, like the narrative acknowledges, like we talked about before, that it's like, hey, it's weird that you only did this 2 days from dying, and also when all of your other heirs were dead.
yeah, the narrative does acknowledge it. But she
So
also feels this incredible burden of faith in that she's like, "Well, if I don't forgive him, he's not going to be able to like go to be reincarnated or to the great beyond or whatever happens to these dragons because they're not sure." So she feels this burden of faith that she has to forgive him in order for his soul to move forward, which I think is also this awful coercion that's happening, that is like a faith-based coercion too. I find this scene to be very frustrating. Again, I don't think it's the worst example of this forced forgiveness in order for the female protagonist to move on with her trauma. I think it could have been handled so much better. And the fact that it wasn't is, again, is just like another problematic depiction of this like or this gender-based trope that is existing in this novel without any kind of commentary or nuance. And maybe if it was the only example of that in this book, I would have been like, okay, yeah, it's kind of falling into that trope, but whatever. But because it's just like one of so many, it's so frustrating to me.
I don't think I have the same interpretation of the scene as you. I do think that there's some like really interesting things about forgiveness in there, but there's also some like kind of dumb stuff about it, which is like this is like such the trope in these types of stories where like someone spends their life suffering and then at like the last 40 pages of the book comes into wealth and money and prestige and then actually all of their suffering was fine and they're good. And I mean they literally say that. It's like, wow, you came to your title and your religion like honestly through all the hard work that you did. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, like she's the main character in a different Regency novel that happened to get smushed into this one.
Yeah. But also, all of her problems are solved by getting married, too.
By getting rich.
But by getting rich and getting married, because like she can't get rich until she gets married,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? So she has to marry, and it's like, oh, I'm no longer a fallen woman. I'm able to marry the man that I kind of like, love, even though it seems like they don't have a very like I don't know. She's like, I
They both love each other, but they just like don't talk about it.
yeah, they're yeah, but it's just like, oh my god, really, all your trauma is gone now because you're able to finally marry and get rich.
Yeah, and also like she's able to find out that her father didn't intend to doom her to this life of suffering. And whether
Yeah.
that's true or not, like that's some comfort.
But you didn't look for her. The most powerful man in this entire realm couldn't have been bothered to look for her until 2 days before he died.
Well, he looked for a while and then he stopped looking for
When
her,
she
but
was a child. They live forever. They're, like, old.
I know. He gave up on looking for her and it's bad.
Yeah, I know that you I mean, this is, like, the same I don't know. Yeah.
We just
I'm never gonna change my mind on this. I
and
hate that
I don't
trope of the woman having to forgive her point of trauma in order to move on, and then suddenly being perfect, perfectly fixed. I think that also sorry, I know that we've been going on this for a while. I think that if, like, the character forgives her point of trauma and then, like, struggles with it a little bit afterwards, like, that makes it more realistic of, like but, like, she's just, like, totally fine in
because the
the end.
book ends. This is the end of the book. There's one more scene of her.
Yeah, okay, whatever. This is just a trope that exists in a lot of books,
Yeah,
where men are allowed to seek revenge, women have to forgive.
that I will 100% get on. Well, I don't have a very particular qualm with depictions of forgiveness. It is a trope that we have to recognize that men solve their problems through violence and women solve their problems through personal growth. And like,
And we're going to see that happening in this next scene.
anyway, to the next scene.
Penn and Cher go to see Daverick to try to get him to take Penn off the stand. And Daverick's like, well, just lie, like, just leave that part out. And they're like, oh, we can't do that. And he's like, why not? You can just do that. Isn't lying better than being removed from the church? And Penn's like, of course not. And then they insist to see Hayner because he's like, well, my sister is ailing. I would like to see her. Daverick refuses. And then they're like, okay, this is weird. So they go to find her room covered in rocks and dig her out. Penn is able to carry her out so she doesn't flush pink because she's related to Penn. And Cher is like
She's dead. She's like,
almost dead.
she's been in there for 3 days at this point. She has not had any water. She's just like,
She's not actually dead.
all right, she's,
She can't even talk though. She's like, please help me.
no, she's not even that. She's like,
They think she's dead when they first see her, but she's not dead. She's alive. She's barely alive. She's mostly alive. Penn carries her out. Cher then challenges Daverack basically to a duel. He's like, send someone and I'll duel them because you don't deserve the rank of illustrious. That's his rank. It's illustrious. The next day in court, Cher goes to Hathor, who's Avon's attorney, and tells him, like, hey, I challenged Daverack to a duel, but he hasn't accepted yet, and I want to challenge him again in court. So can I do that? And also, I really don't want Penn to go on the stand. So Hathor's like, okay, wait until we call Daverack to the stand, and then you can submit your challenge.
and then you can kill him is what.
Yeah, basically kill him. Yeah, which is, a duel sometimes ends in death.
This is an unintentionally hilarious scene. I'm sorry.
It's just so, like, fast. Like, they spend so long on the scene where Daverack dismembers the baby dragons, and this is, like, 2 sentences. So, Hathor calls Daverack to the stand, And Cher like yells from the back of the court. He's like, "Hey, I challenge you!" And he jumps over everyone and starts fighting. And the three judges are like, "Eh,
They seem bored and were like, "Well, this is more exciting than the arguments that they
yeah."
were in the middle of doing because they were talking for a bit before that, and then there's, like, 2 pages of a courtroom scene, and then, Cher is like, "Let's fucking go," and then just, like, charges.
And then the next sentence is like, after much grappling and fire, Cher is standing over Daverek's corpse. It's basically like you don't even get a single sentence of them actually fighting. There's no like just suddenly Daverek is dead and Cher has killed him.
As the podcast fight reporter, sideline
Yeah.
fight reporter, as someone who cares so much about fight scenes, I was like, "All right, well, it's on page," which I guess is good, but it's like a montage fight scene. It's like a cartoon fight scene where you just see, like where there's just, like, a bunch of smoke and then limbs and stars pointing out, and it's like, "Ooh,
Yeah.
ah," and then, like, a fire here, and then, like, the dust clears and they're dead. Like, it's so wacky and stupid and not even really on c it's nothing. It's stupid.
I when I read that, I was like, "Huh, I wonder how JoJo feels about this scene," because you like, the hills I die on are, like, what we just spent 5 minutes talking about. The hills you die on is fight scenes, and
And it makes for a
yeah.
balanced podcast.
Yeah. But I agree with you, this fight scene was dumb. I wish they had spent more time. I would have loved to see a dragon fight that actually was described, but
Or
yeah.
one in the courtroom where, like, they're throwing them into the jurors and, like, jurors are scattering, and then they,
Yeah,
like,
that would've been cool.
light some of the seating on fire, and they're, like, trying to put
How
the
did Davarak not? He, like when his fire is described, it's described as him not really having a lot of control over it, and he only burnt Cher a little bit, like, he didn't hit anyone else with his fire?
the fight ends, and then it goes to one of the grossest I don't know, this one bothered me and I thought was really annoying, which is, like, Cylinder runs up to Cher's wounds and starts licking him and then instantly turns pink. It's just
Yeah.
like the scene in High School Movie where, like, the jock beats the bully and then the cheerleader, like, wraps herself around him and is like, "My
Yeah.
hero." It's like violence gets her hot and pink.
Yeah, and also, like okay, this actually brings up a question that I had when this happened was, so they grow and they eat other dragons. She's licking Cher's blood off of him. He's still alive, but she's, like, eating basically consuming a part of him. Would she grow from that?
You were thinking too much about this. You were definitely thinking more about this than the author did.
I just wanna know. Like, you set out this rule, and I wanna know if you followed the rule in this sense or if it has to be, like, the flesh of the dragon.
It's magic. It's literally magic, so, it could be whatever she wants and she doesn't tell us.
And then the court sides with Avon. And so they divide Daverick's body up in the way that bonds should have been divided. So Cher and Solyndra both take one bite. The jurors also take a small share, and then the rest go to Hayner and Avon.
Can you imagine being called to jury duty, and then in the middle of a jury duty, a fight breaks out, and then you get to go through the pockets of the dude who got murdered as part of your jury duty?
It's just like, what the fuck? So Avon returns to Seabeth. He tells her everything that happens, and then she proposes to him. She's like, "Anyway, do you want to become an eminence?" And he's like, "Oh, wah, wah, wah." And then we cut to Hayner and Solyndra, who are talking, and Hayner's like, "Well, I was supposed to meet your like betrothed before you agreed to be betrothed to him." And Solendra's like, "Well, there's nothing I can do now. I'm pink. What do you want me to do? I turned pink in front of everybody. I'm going to marry him." And then Hayner's like, "But I promised Alonderer the 16,000, and I really do like him." And Solendra's like, "Oh, don't worry. We found an entire giant ancient hoard of gold. I can give you your dowry now. It would be much fun." And so they're squared away.
Yeah, it's like, "Oh, we found all the money at the end, so everybody gets to marry whoever they want." And also, Avon wins his court case not because of, like, him or whatever, it's just because, like, an unrelated dude picked a fight with the guy and ate him in the middle of the court, so I won by default. It's a lot of and, like, a lot of stuff they set up early that, like, does not matter.
What happens to Davarak's holding then? Like, does Avon get it?
They don't
Like,
say.
yeah, who like, what happens to their children? Like, the eggs that are still eggs.
So they do talk about the kids. They
Yeah.
attached to Hayner, but, like, also just lost both their parents and their brother.
They say, like they mentioned because the kids are really worried, and I think it's Amers, like, "Hey, Hayner, they're asking for you because they're really attached to you." And then they're like, "Oh, just throw them with Phelan's kids. They'll be fine if they're all together."
Truly unhinged behavior.
The last thing we hear about these poor, like, traumatized children who experience the death of their brother, their mother, and their father. Unbelievable, really. So they all go to meet the new eminences. They have to, like, announce themselves to the new eminences, and Avon kind of keeps it as a little bit of a surprise to his siblings.
Nobody talks to Avon in this entire family. Like, Cher shows up and at the trial, and Avon's like, "Who the fuck is this guy?" And then they go to meet the Eminence, and Penn shows up, and it's Avon, and it's like, "You're the fucking Eminence now?" And you're like, it's just like, what is Avon part of this family?
No, he's not. Well, I'm, like, kind of wondering if it's because, like, he decided to, like, work for a living, so he's kind of lowered himself in the opinion of the, like, landed nobility, where he's not seeking a higher calling like a parson is, and he's not trying to maintain his life as a landed gentry. He's seeking his fortune like a working class person, but it's not really addressed enough.
It's because he's in the C plot, the 2 sisters are in the A and B plot, and he's in the C plot, and then, like, they just don't talk to each other. Also, I do actually think it's, like, so realistic to families to just, like, have a member of the family that everybody kind of forgets about, nobody talks about. It's like, "Oh, yeah, fuck, Avon's over there somewhere."
Avon, oh, yeah, what's he up to? Yeah, like, at one point, Penn's like, "That floozy that he's living with." And then Avon it, like, cuts to Avon, and Avon's like, "They don't even know about Seabeth. Other than that, she's my clerk, and I sometimes sleep with her." It's like, "Well, what?"
It's both very funny how, like, detached he is, and also maybe one of the more realistic things in the book.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But anyway, so they meet him, but we also meet I haven't talked about this at all, but there's, like, a thing called a yarg in this book that they're like, "Ew, those disgusting yargs."
They talk about it all the time.
And the Catholic dragon religion believes that one of the gods is a Yarg and that the Yargs brought the religion to them. But the Protestant dragon religion believes that that's sacrilege and that it was always a dragon religion. And you picked up on this. I just was like, oh, they're just dragons without wings. But you were like, no, they're humans.
They talk about these yargs all the time, but really, like, tangentially, and I'm like, "They're laying the groundwork for something real stupid. I'll bet these yargs are people," and then they talk about
Yeah.
how, like, when the yargs were around with knights and princesses and stuff, and I'm like, "Oh, they're referencing ancient dragons, and they're also talking about these yargs. They're probably people." And then we meet our first yarg, who's, like, an emissary from a different nation, so the dragons, like, have their own nation. This is, like, so tangentially related to this book, but it's, like, kind of fun and interesting in, like, the greater context of, like, the dragon human relationship, which is like what this podcast about, even though this book doesn't
Yeah.
really care about it. But basically, so just some like fun canon of this own book is that like at some point this was a pretty traditional fantasy world where you had dragons that like stole hordes from people and like fought knights and stuff. And then humans tried to subdue dragons and then the dragons rebelled and they like
For with their cannons, they say that like a dragon fire is no match for a cannon or something.
it's like the guns probably came from dragons didn't invent guns so lady dragons could shoot it. It's probably humans invented guns and stuff. But anyway, so there's human nations like somewhere off in the distance, and then there's this dragon nation, and we meet a Yarg slash human emissary who goes to meet the new eminence, who's Seabeth, if you're from earlier, and the Exalt terrified of a Yarg, which is like kind of funny because she's
Yeah, he a Yarg killed her son, her other son or something.
yeah, because 'cause they're still skirmishing along the borders. There's army people in this book, which is funny because they can fly, shouldn't they be the Air Force? Anyway, yeah, Cher's dad died, fighting a human,
Oh, yeah, it was his dad, yeah.
and the Exalt is, like, terrified and grossed out by him, which is funny because she's 60 feet tall and he is, I think, a 6-foot tall human.
Yeah, it says he's not even 7 feet tall, so he's, like, a normal size, maybe a tall for a human, but, like, yeah, human-sized human.
Yeah, and then Solyndra kind of rescues her, creates an instance where, like, they can hold back so the human can go ahead, and they sort of reconcile, and that's the end of the book.
Yeah, that's how the book ends. I do wanna say, like, I completely missed the fact that Yargs were probably human until you said to me, like, "No, they're human." Because I was like, "Oh, because in the religion, they're like, Yargs are wingless dragons," and I was like, "Oh, because dragons are born without wings, right?" And they talk about how disgusting and small they are, and I'm like, "Yeah, because they don't eat other dragons, so they don't partake in this excess that this new religion believes in." And I was like, "Oh, it's this, like, idea of them thinking that they're disgusting because they don't live through this bloody conflict of consuming each other and greed and excess, so they think that they're disgusting even though, like, they're living these smaller lives." And I was like, "Oh, no, they're just people." And it was just like, "Oh, this could have been" I feel like it could have been, like, this really interesting statement on, like, because the servants can't grow bigger than 7 feet because 'cause they're not allowed to eat other dragons, so they are really small.
So you thought it was a class thing, and I was like,
Yeah.
"I think this writer's on some bullshit." And I was
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, you were right.
Just trying to be cute.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, that's how the book ends.
Yarg.
Mm. Yeah, so, some questions that I had, one big one was, "Why is Cher so large? Who has he eaten?"
Yeah, I think just a thing in this book and, like, why you have so many questions is, like, they, like, don't do a really great job of it's so heavy-handed and on the head and explains some things, and then there's others where it's just like, "I don't know. That's how it is." I think Cher's supposed to be I thought Cher is supposed to be large because he ate his father, but his father died in battle, and they tell you earlier in the
Yeah,
book that if you die in battle, then your fellow soldiers just eat you.
yeah, and I think
So
that is what happened to his dad, they mentioned that.
yeah, so
So who does he eat? Because he even says, like, when he challenges Davra, he's like, "I've never had to do this before. This is the first time I'm doing this."
so I guess Cher's just a magical dragon who's, like, so good and perfect, and that's why he's so big, and he didn't need anyone that we know of. Yeah, it's weird. It doesn't make sense.
There is a little, like I don't know if the author intended this, but I think it's the exile's husband's name is Ladon, and
Mhm.
Ladon is the serpent of the Hesperides in Greek mythology, which is killed by Hercules,
Oh, that's fun.
and I'm not sure if that's intentional or not. I don't think any of these other dragon names are referencing historic dragons, but maybe they are. If they are, and listener, and you wanna share, I would love to know if one of these dragons is, like, a historic dragon.
Yeah,
Uh,
comment on our WordPress page.
yeah, or a YouTube page.
Yeah?
Yeah, I don't know. Or is there anything else you wanna talk about as it concerns this book?
I mean, I think we've talked about it a lot, but this I think, like, the overarching thing that really frustrated me with this book is that it seems to wanna have a conversation about class and
Mhm,
gender,
mhm.
and it seems to be like, I think having rigid hierarchies are bad, but its solution is to just, like, put good people in the rigid hierarchies, whether it's
Yeah,
share eating a dragon, but, like, in the good way because it's a shitty dragon, or even basically getting to do whatever he wants with the people of I mean, it's not called the slums, but it is the slums of it's like, well, it's okay that he gets to unilaterally decide what happens there, and it's
yeah,
okay that the aristocracy get to unilaterally decide what happens on their land because they're good and they don't take bribes and they don't eat
mhm,
people unless they really deserve it. And it's just
yeah,
like kind of like a frustrating thing in the book to be like, you're so close to getting it. I feel like a
yeah.
lot of the dragon books we read, because they engage so much with aristocracy, we haven't read a modern book. So almost every book that we've read has some sort of monarchy.
It's 2003. It's not that old.
Huh? No,
It
no,
was
no,
written
no,
in
no. But I
Oh,
mean,
I
all
see.
of the books are set
Oh,
in
okay.
like
Yeah,
before
but
a modern democracy.
I was thinking about this earlier, and I think this is looking at a Regency book, and I do have to say, I'm just gonna admit it, I don't love reading Regency books, and a lot of it is because of the class and the gender. The gender specifically is like a horror story to me with the way that women were treated at this time period in our history. But, like, it kind of was a bad time to be alive if you weren't British, a white, and male, and rich. Like, if all 4 of those things weren't met, like, you were kind of out of luck at this time, and it's just, like, really kind of stressful to look and hard to look past all of that and enjoy a Regency novel. I think that Regency novels, era novels that were written during that time period can really get away with it because they are looking at these things with the best understanding that the time has. So, we do have Regency era novels that are making commentary on women's rights and class structure in ways that are really interesting and nuanced. Now, they might not feel super modern, but that's because they are, again, working with the ideas that they had at the time. And those ideas that they had at the time might have been really radical for that time. And they just don't feel radical now because we've moved forward as, a culture, but they still really work in certain ways. And this book was written in 2003 and yet didn't engage with these ideas in a way that was nearly as nuanced as some of these books that were written in that time period. And that's what's really frustrating.
Yeah, I was going to say what also makes it frustrating is that it took a lot of basically the pseudoscience and like the gender essentialism
Mhm.
of the era and made it explicit in the sexual dimorphism of the dragons itself.
Yeah.
It decided to literalize, it used dragons to literalize some of the sexist notions of the era, which is frustrating.
It would have worked if they had subverted it better. Like, what if there was a lesbian dragon and she blushed pink when she touched another female dragon? Like, what if there was something like that that happened? Or, like, I don't know. I just feel like there just wasn't enough. The book, so I did write like a short list of all the tropes that were harmful female tropes, but I don't think I even like have all of them. So we have the abortion tea, we have the bitter mother who is really possessive of her son. We have the death during childbirth. We have the damsel in distress. We have the sexual assault theme where the woman's trauma is completely removed through marriage, basically. And then we have that woman narratively is forgiving her point of trauma instead of seeking revenge, while the male character is able to seek revenge for a woman who was wronged by a man.
Yeah, it's frustrating.
And like all of those things exist in this novel. None of them are looked at in a way that's new or refreshing or unique to books that treated those things as if they were actual, inherent, unavoidable parts of a woman's life.
I think what's most frustrating too is like this is our first book with dragons, not only as the main character, but as like most of the characters. And it
Mhm.
would have been real and it would have been so more interesting to see. And they kind of do it with the cannibalism, a much more animalistic
Yeah.
version of that. But other than the fact that they, eat other dragons, there's just not a lot about they're just not very dragony. They really like
No.
gold, but like they just sleep on it, they don't do much else with it. They
Yeah.
spend it the same way humans do.
Yeah, which is weird. Like, you'd think that they'd have a different money system if because, like, it says in the book that sleeping on gold is, like,
Comfy.
they sleep it's not just that it's, like, comfortable like a feather bed, it's like you have the best sleep of your life when you're sleeping on gold. It's how they are supposed to sleep.
It's they sort of are interesting in like the relationship between flying and not flying as in a way of
Yeah,
like showing class and subjugation, but even then it's a little bit muddled.
yeah.
I just want more dragons, you know?
Yeah, I think there would have been better ways to incorporate that dragoniness into I honestly think that if she had put more dragoniness and more, like, feralness into the book, as, like, dragons are, it would have made it even funnier as a Regency era novel that these, like, extremely wild beasts are trying to act like polite, gentle people. But she really, I think, misses the mark in a lot of ways because she tries to make them act so much just like humans.
I do think we're being quite negative on the book because there's definitely a lot of stuff we didn't like in it. And I think it's partially because the parts of it that we do like are so light and airy. There's like fun stuff of the kids playing and of the relationships and of like people talking about class and stuff. And it just sort of like flows over you, which is like part of the prose being so dialogue heavy and very scene unheavy. So it's a book that sort of glides through you until you run into something that's like kind of horrific and you have to stop and think about it for a moment.
Yeah, but, like, I don't begrudge the book all the cannibalism. It was really dark, and it made me, like, think, "Oh, I don't know if I can do this." But I didn't think, like, with the cannibalism, like, "Oh, I don't think I can do this because I think this is bad." It's just it was, like, hard to read, like, in the way that I don't read a lot of horror because I find it hard to read, but when I do pick up a good horror novel, I'm like, "Oh, I don't know if I can finish this, but it's really good. But I don't know, I might need to put it down and pick it up later," you know? Whereas it was, like, the other things in the book that I was just like, "Please be more interesting than this when you're bringing up this subject matter.
Yeah.
Please, like, do something new and don't fall into harmful tropes and stereotypes." I do think that I was more predisposed to dislike it because I it really reminded me why I don't read Regency era books, either written during that era or by contemporary authors who are writing in that time period and in that style. So, think that I can thank that book for for doing that, for reminding me of that.
Oh, I was just gonna say I don't read a lot of Regency books, so I think in some ways, though I see the tropes in it, but in some way I think the way that it's structured and the way that it talks, because I don't read it as much, it had a sort of newness to me
Mhm,
that made it more palatable.
mhm. I mean, I haven't read a Regency era book in a long time. I had to read so many of them in high school, and I just, like, chafed at it. And high school was so long ago.
Yeah, I do have to say the one last thing I want to talk about is I think this is our first book that we've read that the dragons have their own religion. And in
Mhm.
fact, even the books that we've had that have had religions that are part of the novel, the dragons haven't been a part of it. So it's kind of interesting
Yeah.
to see how them set up their own version of like gods and stuff and then have controversies within the church about scripture and stuff. So that was like kind of
Yeah.
fun and interesting and a good bit of world building that we didn't really touch on.
In Earthsea, the dragon myth is that the dragons kind of created the world,
Yeah, they
and
were around for
and
it,
that the
but
language is like the dragon language. But it seems like that's just more of a fact than a religion in that
yeah, they don't worship them.
I also think that in The Dragon Prince, probably if we continued reading, there would be a connection between dragons breathing fire and the Sunbringers, which are fire-based magic system, but we didn't get to that point, so I don't know if that's true or not. No, but you're right. This is the first time we also just have a dragon culture, even aside from religion. So it was interesting to see, especially the places where it kind of diverted. It moved away from human culture with the cannibalism and like the eating to grow and like as they develop fire throughout their life. I thought it was funny, like they didn't call cattle, like they raised cattle and sheep, but they don't call them cattle and sheep, they call them beefs and mutton wools. And then like the constellation, like Hayner's looking at the constellation, she's like, "Oh, the great beef is rising."
So I thought the religion was more, like, specific to the dragons, and then the
Mhm.
culture was, like, Regency and then some fun stuff thrown on top, but I
Well, the
do
cannibalism was not
yeah,
a
yeah,
regency.
well, the cannibalism is, like, it's inspired by a modest proposal, which is so,
Yeah.
like, it's coming from some Regency era ideas.
Yeah, but so is their religion. Their religion is just coming from Christianity.
You know, forgiveness, and then I guess
Is yeah, is,
alright, well,
Catholic.
I take it all back. I agree with you.
But
What we
no, I
wanted
think
was
that I
more of
think that I think that in those cases, like, with the religion, I don't know, I feel like I kind of wanted the religion to be a little bit more separate from Catholicism and Protestantism. I wanted it to feel a little bit more dragony than just like, "Oh, these are stand-ins," and you obviously can see what real religion is.
Mhm. I guess I thought it was a little bit different. Oh, it's because I was like, "Oh, there's 3 different people," and then that's just the Father, Son, and the
Yeah.
Ghost, isn't it? I
Yeah.
just don't know Catholicism. I don't know anything about Christianity.
Yeah, it's just the the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost is what that is.
That's so funny.
I had a moment when I was writing the notes for this that I was like, "Oh, because their religion has 3 people," and I was like, "Oh my god, duh, it's it's the Holy Trinity."
Day I learn about Catholicism and Christianity.
Yeah. So would you recommend this book?
God, it's hard because, like, in some ways it was, like, a really breezy read, and in some ways I was like, "I hate this book. It better end well because 'cause I'm mad at it." I think if you like Regency era books and you wanna read another one.
And you're okay with cannibalism.
Yeah, you're okay with cannibalism. So, like, for those people who are okay with cannibalism,
You're pro cannibalism.
Not pro cannibalism, just no, we're not talking about our pro cannibal audience. No, just okay with cannibalism and really like it. It just like was like an easy read and it wasn't too long.
Yeah, it was fast. If you like Regency novels, you would probably like this book. You would. You really would.
I I don't think I'd recommend it,
No.
but like I can very much understand in all things people who like this book and like quibble with all the quibbles that we've made. Like I think if you and me had a slightly different frame to bring to this book and were less bothered by some of the issues that we were brought in this book, specifically gender and class, that you could get a
Mhm.
fun read out of this. I think that's a thing that exists out there in the world, and I think that's a valid interpretation of the book. I don't think it's our interpretation of the book.
I agree. I think that if I were to recommend this book to myself, I would say, "No, skip this one. You are not going to enjoy it." But, I know people who absolutely like, they read Jane Austen every single year. They reread Pride and Prejudice every single year, and they read I don't know a lot of Regency era books, but they read Emma constantly. They're, like, constantly reading, that one Bronte sister book. What's it called?
You
You
were
know,
once again asking the wrong person.
the one with the girl and there's that woman in the attic.
Jane Eyre?
And yeah, Jane Eyre, they like are always like they read those books every single year they reread them. And they would probably really love this book. So go for it.
There's an audience for this book. It is not us, and we do not recommend it.
But yeah, like whatever. If you like it, that's fine. Like nothing wrong with that.
As always, this podcast is purely our opinions. We do not think we are right because we do not think you can be right about a book, you know?
Yeah, and like I feel like I have really strict rules surrounding like women in books specifically. And if they don't pass those tests, then I'm like, nope, done, not interested in this book.
And we don't even always agree. So,
Yeah, and I think again, like that I just want it to be done better than it was done in this book.
yes. And I think we could both agree that there are definitely places this book could have been better.
This has been Tooth and Claw by Jo Walton.
So, what are we reading next?
We are going to read Serafina by Rachel Hartman.
So, we picked this book out because, and we are not sure, we think this is another book where the protagonist is a dragon, but we're not sure.
I think she can shapeshift, but I'm not sure. Or maybe she can she's like part dragon and part human?
Anyway, there are dragons in this book, and maybe the protagonist is a dragon. And I'm trying at this point to sort of chain these books together now that we're sort of out of the introductory to sort of like
Mhm.
see if we can build on things because we talked about this earlier, but like I thought this was a good thing to read after His Majesty's Dragons because you could sort of see how two different books that merge two different canons together handle that merging and how one did it better than maybe the other one.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to see in Serafina maybe some rhyming with this book. That's all we have today. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a like and hit the subscribe button.
Leave a comment if you'd like to. If you have any Regency novels that you're like, if you don't like Regency era novels, you probably would really like this Regency era novel. I would actually be really interested in hearing that. What were your thoughts personally on Tooth and Claw? Would you recommend this book to others? Let us know. And let us know what other dragon books you would like us to read next. Do you want to say bye?
It is.
Oh, I didn't hear it.
Bye.
Oh, you cut out again.
Bye.
Okay, I heard you that time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.